Part 1, The Court. The July sun was harsh through the high, arched windows of the Sterling County Courthouse. Rays of light filtered through the antique stained glass, casting multicolored streaks of light on the polished marble floor. Courtroom 7 was packed today, with not a seat left empty. The air was stifling not only because of the old building's aging air conditioning system, but also because the tension in the air was like a string waiting to be turned on. The clock on the wall struck 9 a.m. The ceiling fans spun slowly, doing little to cool the summer heat. The public seats had filled early, mostly curious townspeople, a few local reporters, and a few law students from nearby Sterling College. They whispered among themselves, creating a constant buzzing noise like the buzzing of bees. "Everyone stand," the court clerk's shrill voice rang out, cutting off all conversation. Sterling County Court, State of New Hampshire, criminal trial for the morning of July 15th, Judge Walter Harrington presiding, now in session. Everyone in the room stood as a tall man in his 60s, wearing a long, imposing black robe, entered through the back door. Judge Walter Harrington, with his neatly cropped silver hair and broad shoulders, exuded the sternness of a man who had spent more than 3 decades in the justice system. The deep lines that creased his forehead and the corners of his eyes were signs not only of age, but also of a man who had witnessed too much crime and deceit in his long career. "Sit down," Harrington commanded, his voice deep and authoritative, not needing to be raised to be heard clearly across the courtroom. He sat down in the high black leather chair behind the podium, placing a thick stack of files in front of him. The court clerk, a slim middle-aged woman with tightly coiffed hair and red-rimmed glasses, stood up and announced, "The next case, CR 2025-0714, is the state against Amara Jenkins for obstruction of justice under New Hampshire Penal Code Section 642:3 and trespassing on the scene of a criminal investigation under New Hampshire Penal Code, Section 644:2. All eyes in the courtroom turned to the left door, where defendants were usually ushered in. The door opened, and a black woman emerged, accompanied by a young female sheriff. Unlike many defendants who appeared sullen or nervous, this woman walked with surprising confidence, her back straight and her head held high. Amara Jenkins, the court clerk said, was in her 40s, wearing a simple but elegant gray business suit, a crisp white blouse underneath, and shiny black high heels. Her naturally curly hair was pulled back, revealing an oval face with sharp features and deep, steely eyes. There was no sign of jewelry on her, except for a simple watch on her left wrist. Amara walked to the defense table, where a blonde woman in her 50s in a navy suit was waiting. Sarah Whitman, Amara's defense attorney, extended her hand to shake her clients, and the two sat down at the defense table on the right side of the courtroom. Across the table, at the prosecution table, David Porter, an ambitious young prosecutor in an expensive charcoal gray suit, was sorting through his papers. With his neatly cropped brown hair and angular face, Porter looked like the stereotype of a rising prosecutor on a legal TV show, confident, determined, and willing to do whatever it took to win the case. Judge Harrington put on his gold-rimmed glasses and looked down at the paper in front of him. He skimmed through the case information, the wrinkles on his forehead deepening. Harrington was known in the legal community as Harrington the Hammer, a judge who would not tolerate any lawbreakers, no matter how minor. He was especially tough on obstruction of justice charges, seeing them as a personal affront to the system he had served his entire life. Harrington looked up, his cold gaze sweeping over Amara, then stopping at Prosecutor Porter. "Prosecutor Porter, brief me on the case," he ordered, his voice flat and emotionless. Porter stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked to the front of the judge's podium. "Your Honor," he began, his voice resonating confidently throughout the courtroom, "on the morning of July 13th, at the scene of a homicide at apartment 1502 Riverside Heights, the defendant Amara Jenkins entered the scene without permission. When asked to leave, the defendant refused and attempted to access evidence. Officers Michael Rodriguez and Thomas Baker had to use force to remove the defendant from the scene." Porter paused, letting the story sink in. Not only did the defendant obstruct the investigation of a serious homicide, but he may have contaminated vital evidence, he emphasized. This conduct seriously jeopardized our ability to administer justice. Judge Harrington nodded, then turned to the defense table. Defendant Jenkins, do you plead guilty or not guilty? Amara stood up, straightened her back, and looked the judge straight in the eye. Not guilty, Your Honor. Her voice was deep, clear, and confident, without a trace of trepidation or nervousness. This seemed to surprise Harrington, a rarity for the longtime judge. So, Miss Jenkins, Harrington looked down at her from the podium, his voice laced with sarcasm, you think you can show up at the scene of an active crime without a warrant? What do you think these regulations are? Optional suggestions? A quiet chuckle drifted from the back of the courtroom. Judge Harrington was known for his sharp comments and was not afraid to show contempt for defendants he deemed disrespectful of the system. Who do you think you are? He continued, his voice rising a little. FBI? CIA? Or just a private citizen who thinks he can do whatever he wants? Amara remained calm, unfazed by the judge's sarcasm. She replied calmly, I had a good reason to be there, Your Honor. Oh, really? Harrington raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into a smirk. And what was that reason? Curiosity? Or do you think you could do the police's job better than they could? Louder chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Several reporters quickly took notes, clearly enjoying the exchange. Amara pursed her lips but remained respectful. I was doing my job, Your Honor. A job? Harrington's voice rose a notch, carrying an unmistakable sarcasm. He glanced around the courtroom, as if to share the joke with everyone. What kind of business is it that you have a duty to trespass on a police investigation site, Miss Jenkins? Amara opened her mouth to speak, but Harrington raised his hand to stop her, making a dramatic gesture. Let me guess, he said, creating a dramatic pause. Are you a reporter? Looking for a sensational story to save your career? He shook his head. Or perhaps you are a private investigator, thinking you're smarter than our police force. A mocking smile crossed his lips. No, I know. Are you some kind of activist who thinks you know the law better than the people who enforce it? Each word he uttered was like a needle piercing the tense air of the courtroom. Several people in the room began to giggle. Porter, the prosecutor, didn't even try to hide his triumphant grin. Sarah Whitman, Amara's attorney, half rose as if to protest, but Amara gently placed her hand on her arm, signaling her to stop. Amara looked the judge straight in the eye, unfazed by the sarcasm. I have the right to remain anonymous in this situation, Amara replied, her voice calm but her eyes beginning to flash. Oh, ho! Harrington clapped his hands dramatically, the sound echoing throughout the courtroom. A hidden movie star? Or perhaps a secret agent? He laughed, and many in the room joined in, creating an almost jovial atmosphere, except at the defendant's table. This time, Sarah Whitman stood up, her face tight with anger. Your Honor, I object to the way you are treating my client, she said, her voice firm and professional. This is a trial, not a comedy show. My client is exercising his legal rights and is being treated with the respect that is due. Objection, Attorney Whitman, Harrington replied, unwavering. I am trying to determine your client's identity and motives, which she seems reluctant to reveal. He turned back to Amara, his eyes piercing. Miss Jenkins, if you do not answer my questions, I will hold you in contempt of court and punish you accordingly. I have no patience for secrecy. The room was silent, tense enough to cut with a knife. Reporters paused in mid-page, waiting for an answer. All eyes were on Amara. She looked the judge straight in the eye, her hands resting on the wooden rail in front of her, her fingers tapping lightly on the polished surface. In the light from the window, Amara's eyes sparkled with unwavering determination. She took a deep breath, as if weighing each word she was about to say. Your Honor, her voice rang out clearly, without a trace of tremor, I respect the court and the law. I have spent my life upholding and protecting the laws of this country. She paused. But I also have a duty to protect classified information related to national security. The phrase national security caused a few surprised murmurs to spread through the courtroom. Judge Harrington raised his eyebrows, clearly not expecting this turn of conversation. But in a split second, his surprise quickly turned to a loud laugh. The laughter echoed throughout the courtroom, causing everyone to look at each other in confusion and amusement. National security. Harrington repeated, shaking his head in disbelief. I have heard all sorts of defenses in my 35-year career, but this is just creative. He shook his head, his expression full of mockery. What are you going to say next? That you are a secret agent? Working for a secret government agency? Harrington leaned forward, his hands on the table, his blue eyes piercing Amara. Where do you think you are, Ms. Jenkins? In a Hollywood spy movie? Or do you think I, and this court, are naive enough to believe such a fantasy? He straightened, smiling contemptuously. Who do you think you are? CIA? FBI? Or perhaps the United States Secret Service? A moment of silence fell over the judge's final words, as if time had frozen. Amara remained impassive, unfazed by the sarcasm, but her eyes were now steely, staring straight into Harrington's. Exactly, she said, her voice deep and clear, echoing in the silence of the courtroom. I am the Deputy Director of the United States Secret Service, in charge of the Special Investigations Division. Part 2, The Truth Revealed. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Many people rose from their seats to get a better look at the scene. A few reporters furtively took notes, despite the courtroom's prohibition against recording audio or video. Judge Harrington sat up straight in his chair, the mocking smile still on his lips but beginning to fade. His eyes wavered between doubt and confusion. Are you kidding? He asked, his voice losing its earlier mockery. If this is a joke, I can assure you the consequences will be severe. Amara did not answer immediately. She looked around the courtroom carefully, her eyes lingering for a moment on the back door, where two men in black suits stood silently observing. They nodded to her, a gesture almost imperceptible if one did not pay close attention. No, Judge Harrington. This is not a joke. Amara's voice was low, carrying the weight of power and responsibility. I demand to speak to you and the prosecutor in private, immediately. I'm making the decision here, Ms. Jenkins, Harrington protested, but the volume of his voice had dropped considerably. You can't just come out and make statements like that without evidence. Without another word, Amara reached into her suit pocket, moving slowly and carefully so as not to be misunderstood. She pulled out a gold-plated card with an eagle, the insignia of the United States Secret Service shining in the courtroom lights. Next to it was an identification card with her photo, along with a security barcode and a hologram seal of the United States government. Your Honor, this is my identification, Amara said, her voice calm but authoritative. I can also provide an authentication code so you can check directly with Homeland Security if necessary. Amara handed the card to a nearby marshal. He looked at it, then back at Amara, surprise evident on his face. He then handed it to the court clerk, who handed it to Judge Harrington. The courtroom was deathly silent, tense enough to cut with a knife. All eyes were on the judge as he picked up the card, turning it under the lights to check the security features. Harrington's face slowly turned from red to pale. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. The lines on his forehead deepened, and a bead of sweat was visible on his temple. Harrington stammered, trying to regain his composure. I need to verify this. Of course, sir, Amara replied. I can request a private hearing to explain my presence at the scene without compromising the ongoing investigation. But I must emphasize that time is of the essence. The prosecutor, who had been smiling smugly, was now twirling a pen in his hand, looking puzzled. Sarah Whitman, Amara's attorney, sat down with a small smile on her face, as if she had seen this coming. Judge Harrington ran a hand over his face, trying to regain his composure. He looked down at the badge again, then looked up at Amara with a completely different look than before's, no longer contempt, but rather a reluctant respect and, perhaps, a little shame. I request a closer look at this evidence, Judge Harrington finally said, his voice hoarse. And I think we need to discuss this in private. I agree, Judge, Amara nodded, her voice professional. Harrington looked around the courtroom, where the audience was still gaping in amazement at the sudden turn of events. The court is adjourned, Judge Harrington announced, banging his gavel. Everyone in the room, except Deputy Director Jenkins, her attorney, and the prosecutor, leave the courtroom. Immediately. As the gavel rang out, two men in black suits entered from the back door, standing on either side of the door and monitoring the departing crowd. They said nothing, but their presence created an air of seriousness and professionalism. As people filed out, the murmur of what they had just witnessed continued to echo. Is she really the United States Secret Service? Judge Harrington looks like she just swallowed a frog. Did you see that badge? It's beautiful. Harrington sat in his chair, his eyes on the papers before him, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. His hand shook slightly as he held the pen. Across the courtroom, Amara Jenkins stood straight, her face as calm as a still lake, but there was a glint in her eye, a satisfaction at having completed her initial task, revealing herself. When the room was empty, one of the men in black suits walked in, locked the courtroom door, and stood guard. The other approached Amara, nodded slightly, and whispered, "It's safe, Deputy Director." Part 3, Behind the Badges. The atmosphere in Judge Harrington's private office was palpable. The room was decorated in expensive oak and the shelves were filled with classic legal codes. The walls were decorated with lavish awards and certificates, along with a few photos of Harrington with famous politicians and powerful figures. Amara sat across from the judge, her back straight, her shoulders broad, exuding the confidence of someone accustomed to power. Beside her sat attorney Sarah Whitman, who was tapping her pen lightly on her file. Prosecutor David Porter sat in a corner, flipping through case files, trying to figure out what was really going on. Agent Thompson, one of the two men in black suits, stood silently by the door, his eyes scanning the room warily. Deputy Director Jenkins, Harrington finally said, his voice losing its previous arrogance. He loosened his tie, as if he were stifling it. "I have contacted the Attorney General and received confirmation of your identity. I apologize for my lack of respect. But I need to understand why a high-ranking official of the United States Secret Service would show up on the scene without notifying local law enforcement." Amara nodded slightly, acknowledging the apology but not commenting on it. She pulled a file from her briefcase, stamped secret in red, with the embossed eagle of the United States government. "Before we begin," she said, her voice professional and calm, "I need everyone in this room to sign this confidentiality agreement. What I am about to disclose concerns national security at the highest level." She slid the agreements toward each person. Porter skimmed them, frowning. "Does this mean I can't reveal anything we discuss here, even to the Chief Justice?" he asked, his voice filled with doubt. "Exactly," Amara said curtly. "This information is classified at the level of specially secret. Only those with Alpha 9 access codes are allowed to know." Porter exchanged glances with Harrington, and they both signed the document. Sarah, Amara's attorney, signed without hesitation. She was clearly used to this kind of procedure. After collecting the signed agreements, Amara opened the file and pulled out a thick document with the seal of the Department of Homeland Security. "This is an authorization from the Department of Homeland Security," she said, handing the document to Harrington. "As you can see, it is signed by the President and the Director of National Intelligence." Harrington read the document quickly, the wrinkles on his forehead deepening as he read the information contained within. "Money laundering and arms trafficking across borders?" he asked, his voice low, his eyes scanning the intricate text and charts in the document. "Involving high-ranking government officials?" Amara nodded, her expression serious. "The crime scene you're investigating, Jonathan Mercer's apartment, is a key link in the international money laundering ring we've been tracking for the past 3 years. The evidence suggests that Mercer is more than just the ordinary businessman he appears to be." She pulled out a stack of photos and laid them out on the table. The photos showed Mercer meeting with various figures in locations around the world: a fancy restaurant in Dubai, a casino in Macau, a private yacht off the coast of Monaco. Mercer is actually a senior coordinator in an international money laundering network called Black Lotus, Amara continued. The network involved criminal organizations from Russia, China, and South America, with the complicity of a number of government officials and influential businessmen. Then why didn't you contact us in the first place? Attorney Porter interjected, his displeasure evident. We could have cooperated. Security, Amara said simply, then glanced at Agent Thompson at the door. He nodded slightly, then pulled a small device from his pocket and began scanning the room. We have reason to believe that there are people in local law enforcement, Amara continued, her voice low. This is not about questioning your expertise or loyalty. This is a matter of national security of the highest order. Agent Thompson circled the room, the device in his hand beeping softly as it approached the lamp on Harrington's desk. He quickly removed the lamp and pulled out a small device the size of a fingertip. Bugged, he said simply, placing the device in a small bag and continuing to examine it. Harrington paled. In my office? How is that possible? This is no ordinary device, Amara explained. It uses the latest technology, which can transmit data over cellular networks without being detected by conventional security devices. Only a few countries in the world have this technology. After Agent Thompson confirmed that there were no other listening devices, Amara opened another folder, pulling out several photos of a luxury watch. This is the victim's gold Rolex Daytona, found at the scene, she said, showing the photo to Harrington and Porter. On the surface, it looks like a regular expensive watch. But in fact, it has a tiny transmitter and receiver embedded inside the dial. She handed them another photo, of the watch disassembled, revealing a complex electronic circuit inside. Mercer is not a common criminal or an innocent victim as he appears, Amara continued, her voice low. He is a double agent, working for both us and an international terrorist organization called the Covenant. Harrington and Porter exchanged surprised glances. Sarah, Amara's lawyer, remained impassive, as if she knew all this already. This watch, Amara pointed to the photo, contains data on the financial transactions and identities of dozens of our undercover agents around the world. If it falls into the wrong hands, the consequences would be catastrophic. So, Amara continued, I need to get to the scene to retrieve this watch before someone else discovers its secrets. We have intelligence that the Covenant has sent a specialized team to recover it. I have only a few hours to act. Why was Mercer killed? Part 4, Justice is done. A week later, in a closed courtroom attended only by a select few, Judge Harrington banged his gavel and announced. After considering the evidence presented, the court hereby dismisses Deputy Director Amara Jenkins of the United States Secret Service. Furthermore, the court recognizes Deputy Director Jenkins's significant contributions to the security of our nation. Amara stood silently, nodding slightly at the judge. There was no triumph in her eyes, only relief at being able to continue her work. When the courtroom ended, Judge Harrington stepped down from the podium and approached Amara. Deputy Director Jenkins, he said, his voice low. I want to offer my sincerest apologies for my conduct in the last hearing. I acted unprofessionally and disrespectfully. Amara looked him straight in the eye. Judge Harrington, in my work, I have learned that sometimes prejudices and assumptions can obscure the truth. We all make mistakes. You are too lenient, Harrington said, her face sincere. But I have learned a valuable lesson, never judge a person by their appearance. I think many of us need to be reminded of that. Justice is not about color or gender, Judge, Amara smiled slightly. It is only about the truth. When Amara Jenkins left the courthouse, she was no longer a woman accused of a crime, but a symbol of courage and determination. The story of the black woman who stunned a proud judge when she flashed her Secret Service badge spread through the legal community, becoming a story told over and over again about not judging a person by their appearance. And in the office of the United States Secret Service, Deputy Director Amara Jenkins continues her work, protecting the country from threats that lurk in the shadows, a silent hero whose existence few know exists. And Judge Walter Harrington? He continues his work in court, but in a much more humble manner. And on his desk, next to a family photo, there is a small card with the words, "Justice is only interested in the truth."